All right, you are live, the little pop-up tells me. Welcome everybody. Here we are, July 2022. Man, that is wild. This year's half over already. I don't know if it feels fast for everyone else or slow or what, but for me it feels like this is just kind of zipping by. And this month I asked Chris Daw to join us. You prefer Chris or CT or?
I go by either. I mean, it's been so long since we've been kind of identifying ourselves as what was originally a university email handle, and then became a Twitter handle, and then became a Slack handle. Um, the claim to fame that I have is that I'm always the second person um, to register for a particular service with the initials CDAW. And so CDAW is always gone by the time that I show up.
Gotcha.
And so
You
becomes
should go
Christopher
by,
Thomas.
just go by C. That would be bold. Just C. What up, C? Anyway, so
I should
tell
have
us
done that.
about yourself. For the people that don't know who you are and what you do, who are you and what do you do?
So I am a longtime Apple Consultants Network member based out of Seattle, specializing in Apple tech and to a certain extent network technology. My customer base tends to consist of small business, some startups in tech and manufacturing sectors, um, and then some private K to 12 education as well. So most of my customer base tends toward kind of the smaller side, the type of organizations that don't necessarily have dedicated IT. And in a lot of cases, what I'm trying to do is act as an IT service provider for them. And there's an extent to which that's very much a generalist jack of all trades kind of role. And I get very excited about a few things. One is deployment of Apple tech. I get very excited about networking and Wi-Fi, doing those things well. And then in the last few years, I've branched into a little bit more consulting in the Wi-Fi realm, a little bit more in the space of the oddities of Wi-Fi, and talking about Wi-Fi is what it is and why it works the way that it does, or in a lot of cases doesn't. So based out of Seattle, so it's I think approximately an 83-degree July day here in Seattle, which means that for us it's hot and we're sheltering. And I know that at least one of us on the call today is down in Texas, which is where I grew up. And all I can say is that once you've spent sufficient time in Seattle, 83 degrees really is hot.
I have to say I've heard about some heat waves across the U.S. and man, I almost feel bad because I have to say it has been gorgeous in New York. Just it seems like the last few years, people in New York complain about like, oh, we didn't get a spring. It went right from winter to really hot, and this has just been the most gorgeous, like slow ramp up to that, and slightly for anyone who's been to New York, it's the humidity that really kills you. Like it's been relatively low humidity for New York, so uh, like every morning I try to get out for walk, bike ride, or run or something. I keep
Mhm.
thinking like I'm doing it now, before the weather gets too hot and take advantage of the nice weather, but it just hasn't turned. So I feel a little bit bad because yeah, I know probably like half of the people directly on this call right now are like dealing with 90, 100-degree weather, which can be
Yeah.
really rough.
Yeah, we Seattle is very much a non-air conditioning town, and so we did our heat wave at the end of June 2021, and I think we hit 107 at the airport and 97 in the west-facing bedroom of our townhouse, and no air conditioning, and you're sleeping on the ground floor in the kitchen.
Yeah, yeah, wow.
That's all you can do.
That's an interesting question, has that affected any of your clients?
One thing that's really the weather here tends toward a very mild form of rain, and so the stereotype for Seattle has always been kind of very gentle, almost drizzly kind of rain. And as my impression of climate change has kicked in, what we've seen is we've seen more in the way of windstorms. We've seen more in the way of thunderstorms, more in the way of very dry summers that are leading to more wildfires and mudslides. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, I would feel like, okay, we're going to get your organization a few UPS battery backups. This is kind of a pro forma thing we do for protection. Now it's becoming a very real requirement. And that's a very, I've lived in Seattle since 1999, and that feels like something that has transitioned into being a very real kind of non-pro forma requirement over the course of the last 5 to 7 years.
That's also really interesting. So I know you mentioned on your intro that you focus kind of like on small to medium businesses. How small to medium?
So we work with anybody from, I think I've got a customer that has 2 people, one based here and one based in Salt Lake City, and we handle tiny little office networks with a couple of workstations around that, upstream internet connection. For the most part, the days of in-house servers are kind of going away. We do still see requests for network attached storage for very large data volumes for folks, but by and large, we see a lot of moving towards Google Drive, a lot of moving towards Box, a lot of moving towards Microsoft hosted storage and the Office 365 environment. And really, the smaller the business is, the more appealing it is to do that, because the emergency of someone with a 2-person office having their server down and having to spend an hour in transit to get to it, given Seattle's environment, it's just much less appealing. It's almost nonsensical at this point to spend time managing sort of internal infrastructure that way.
Yeah. So that was the battery backup question. Like, it's probably not for servers and server racks. It's just for like the network switches and.
It's very much so at this point. It's very much for the network uplinks. We have on our larger side of our customers, we've got, as an example, a veterinary practice that has 3 clinics scattered around Seattle, and they've got, unfortunately, a single line of business application that's hosted internally in the form of a database server, and that's something that they're going to spend the next year probably trying to move out. But they have
Tell me it's FileMaker Pro.
It's absolutely FileMaker based. It's absolutely FileMaker based. I mean, this is the Mac small business community we're talking about. There are dozens and dozens of FileMaker based vertical market applications out there, and at least some of them come with a requirement on the part of the developer that says, I am absolutely unwilling to host this on a server in AWS, and I'm only willing to host this on a piece of Apple hardware. And at the same time, you talk to the customer and you talk to the users of this application, and they say that we have been in this field for decades, and we have never run into an end user application that we prefer working with over this. The idea of moving to a web-based application for us is torture because of the way that we're accustomed to working. This FileMaker driven UI is fantastic for us. And so for that particular organization, I've got a network rack at each location with a 1500 volt amp UPS sitting underneath the network rack, so that if at least the power goes out, they can maintain network connectivity for an hour to 2 hours, work off the laptop, that kind of thing. And it works well enough, they have a particular site that has been liable to day-long power outages. So we're now talking with them about working with the landlord on the building for a full building generator system, because their feeling is that the revenue loss is that high when they lose power for a full business day every 2 months.
Yeah, wow.
I can't disagree.
Yeah. And that's a little bit more of the traditional case where you get this big, 3,000 or whatever UPS, you have it at the bottom of the rack that, keeps your FileMaker server up and running.
Absolutely.
Chris, I would definitely recommend that you start looking at Amazon's new EC2 M1 clusters. They're relatively recent. I mean, maybe take a copy of that FileMaker app that you have to have running on Apple native hardware and see how it runs. Do some performance testing.
This is something that we've discussed a little bit, Damien. And I think that what the customer has concluded is that FileMaker just isn't scaling to the extent that their business is requiring, even in a we threw the database on as a last ditch measure to see what kind of performance we get. We threw the database on a Mac Studio with 4 terabytes of SSD and 32 gigs of RAM, and even in the local location where the database is hosted, they're still running into performance issues. And that's essentially turned the operations management team at the customer towards the decision of, okay, we have to tear off this Band-Aid. We have to find another solution. We just don't feel that there's another way around this.
Yeah. A couple of years ago at my prior job, we had a student information system, among other things, running on a FileMaker based platform, and we threw tens of thousands of dollars worth of hardware at it, really fast Windows machines running FileMaker, and it just it could not, FileMaker did not scale and could not perform. And so eventually, like you said, our decision was to rip that Band-Aid off and go to a different solution.
Yeah, and in this particular case, you can't really get away from a discussion like that, because you come back to who the vertical market developer is, and they say, we will only support this product running on an on-premise Mac or an on-premises Mac. You can't get away from that. And you may get a comment along the lines of, I'm sorry, but Amazon Web Services just isn't good enough for our application. And that's the point at which the discussion, for better or for worse, has to just kind of stop.
Yeah. The AWS offering is really interesting, but it's also on their Mac.
It's expensive, isn't it?
Expensive.
Yeah, it's expensive.
Compared to, spinning up a regular like Linux EC2 instance or something, it's super expensive. So Mac Stadium has kind of become my go-to for those needs in general. I know people using them, and if you're going to utilize them, it makes sense. But doing these sort of like, spurious workloads, it's just going to kill you in terms of cost. Like, you're going to get your AWS bill and your eyes are just going to roll out of your head.
Yeah, absolutely.
Papine added in chat, how does this spreadsheet scale? Is not asking the right question. So, and of course, in chat here, Eric mentioned HyperCard. Maybe that's a good start.
We could.
They're almost from the same era,
They really are.
Yeah. One of the other things I'm super interested in is the Wi-Fi work that you do. Like, that's always fascinated me. Like, there are certain things I've always just sort of like been on the periphery of, and I know a bunch of people who are into like hardware hacking and radio signals, and like they've shown me all this stuff, and I've never gotten like pulled all the way into it. But like when I see people with all this Wi-Fi, spectrum analyzers and conflicting channels, like, I love it. I think it's fascinating. I just have not been able to like really throw myself into it. So is that the type of work you're talking about? Like,
absolutely. We get called in some cases to come down to an existing site. Oftentimes it's a customer of another vendor. So we work for example, with a internet services broker in the Seattle area. We work with them to help some of our customers find what is the appropriate internet service for a particular location or a set of locations. And the veterinary practice is a very good example, because they are geographically diverse enough that finding a single provider for them so that they only had one vendor to work with and one vendor to yell at was a bit of a chore. And we were able to work with a services broker. I think the third location ended up being a circuit from provider A, but because provider A wasn't willing to pay the access fees to the building that they were in,
Yeah.
provider B did a sort of private label arrangement, so that the bill says B, but the circuit is actually A, and so there's still one source of technical support to call. And that was a very interesting revelation for me in that particular conversation. Was like, oh, somebody's not willing to pay your access fee to your particular building. That was a new concept for me. I hadn't run into that before. That it essentially, a building landlord or a building owner in a very large office building in Seattle might not be willing to allow access unless they frankly get a kickback. And that kind of that is sort of tangential to the Wi-Fi work, but because the broker has called us in to customers that they've worked with, saying, this startup just moved into a new building in downtown Seattle, and they're having Wi-Fi trouble, and they're blaming our fiber circuit for it. Or we think they're having Wi-Fi trouble, they're blaming the internet for it. We're not sure if they need to go get a new firewall or if they need to upgrade their fiber yet again or get a second fiber circuit. And there is a lot of walking into a space with equipment and software and just opening the laptop, firing up the tool and saying, okay, if you know the rules to Wi-Fi, which from a standpoint of wired networking are extremely counterintuitive, this is what is wrong here. You can start with half a dozen fixes, apply and see what happens. And it can be an hour or two of work. It doesn't have to be necessarily deeply involved, because a couple of things happen. One is that startups will tend to, in a lot of cases, try to manage themselves. And that can lead to, oh, hey, this vendor told me that this equipment was magic. And it's rarely magic. Every vendor has its own idiosyncrasies. Every vendor has its own sort of odd way of behaving in a new installation. Cisco Meraki is different from Ubiquiti, is different from Ruckus, is different from Aruba. And sometimes it gets a little severe. You walk in and realize that they don't know where any of the equipment is. Which was that was a scenario I dealt with recently. They had a customer of mine had a generalist IT firm come in and do the Wi-Fi installation. And when I asked what the names of the access points were and where they were installed, there was no documentation for that. Yeah. So sometimes you spend time just figuring that out.
Yeah. I will admit, when you mentioned earlier and you said you're a generalist, that's kind of the thing that I really missed from when I was consulting, because like one day you're doing networking, another day you're doing OS level stuff, and another day you're doing internet and or Wi-Fi or whatever. I always provided documentation. That was my big, and sometimes, you'd hand off documentation and no one would ever read it. And then like 2 months later, I'd get a call from someone saying like, hey, I need the password to blah, 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 blah. I'm like, it's in the documentation I gave you. Like, just go reference it.
But at least it's there.
Yeah.
At least it's there.
Like if your network, you own all the stuff. Here's all the information. But I definitely remember days where similar like to what you're talking about is like, okay, well, let's figure out where this is plugged in. And you have someone sort of like take the Ethernet
Mhm.
cable in and out, and you're just looking for a switch port that's sort of like blinking in that rhythm, and you're like, oh, there it is. Here's where all this traces back to.
Yeah, frankly, one of the hardest parts of being a consultant, particularly on small business, is, and my partner, who I live with, Emily, can attest to this. She can hear the sigh from upstairs or downstairs. The oh, this again, and that can be very challenging, both from a standpoint of, your customers are people. You're not here to insult your customers, make them feel bad. You're here because you have a level of expertise that they don't have.
Yep.
And sometimes it helps to blame the vendors. I feel a little bit less bad about blaming the vendors. You send equipment out into the field with these defaults. This is a terrible thing. Don't do it. But still.
So one thing I was thinking about a little bit when you were mentioning getting an office wired up for both internet access and Wi-Fi, I think probably everyone directly on this call has seen both of those things go from sort of like a luxury to a necessity, right? Like I definitely remember sort of back in the days of like before internet access, and
Mm-hmm.
I had a company that I was working for, and we had email, and it was like a CC mail server, and every hour it would dial up the provider, download all the mail, hang up, and then people would send mail, it would queue up next hour, dial up, do all the transfers, and like no one cared, right? No one thought they were going to get email
Right.
right away. And then as the internet became sort of a thing, I remember having some smaller customers that like all they could afford or wanted to pay for was like DSL, which was great when it worked, but that also
Mm-hmm.
prevented them from using like Salesforce or some, software as a service because like I don't know, the DSL might go out and we don't have any guarantees. Like it might be down for 4 days. Who knows? So like it
And,
kind of prevented them from getting into the SaaS model.
and yeah, at the time, those tools were so few and far between that it was seen as arguable that you didn't necessarily need anything better,
Right.
and
But
that changed quickly.
yeah, that definitely changed quickly. And then I think the same thing for Wi-Fi. Like everything was already wired up and you're used to using Ethernet. And then like Wi-Fi came along and if it worked great, if it was kind of janky, all right, I'll just plug in, no big deal. But now it's, kind of Wi-Fi everywhere. So on the back of that, I'm curious in the businesses, at least that you're seeing and serving, how much of a return to office has there been, if it ever stopped for like I know some small businesses that I know people that work for near me, like they never stopped during the pandemic. They kept going to offices and they did temperature checks and all the things, but like they never actually
Mm-hmm.
stopped going to
Mm-hmm.
offices. So all those services were still important to them, having a local Wi-Fi and Ethernet network and internet access. But nowadays you also have companies that are just like, nope, forget it. We're remote. Everyone works from home. So
Yep.
kind of doing your own IT at home, right? If something goes down, like, I'm rebooting the router or whatever.
Right, and that's something that we found. So we found a couple of things. Our customer base is a mixture enough that we have folks that never went home or went home only minimally. I can think of the veterinary practice as a great example because the amount of work from home and increase in people working from home led to a skyrocketing rate of pet ownership in Seattle and led to skyrocketing business in the veterinary world in general. Those folks never went home. And in a lot of cases, we have seen, and in discussions with a couple of these customers, typically my experience is veterinary clinics will have kind of a hierarchical list of, if we're full today and you need to go to these emergent, if your pet has an emergency, we're going to give you the names of these 5 clinics in priority order. And for the entirety of COVID, everyone has been full all the time. The availability of appointments and the availability of access fell to what I would almost describe as a catastrophic degree. You can't get a pet in for an emergency, or at least it's very difficult. And I happen to have a few personal contacts in places far afield from Seattle who are in that business. And so I've got a very good friend who's in Oxford, Mississippi, and is a veterinarian. And what she told me is that people were willing to go as far as Nashville and Memphis in order to get an appointment. And that was where they were referring folks to. We saw a lot of, and we have seen a lot of stress. We've seen a lot of burnout in those types of businesses. And we have continued to serve those businesses as best we can. And I'll toot my own horn a little bit and say, I've been able to set up systems and networks that don't need a lot in terms of active management. They just run. And so we spend more of our time doing conceptual stuff, like operating system upgrades to stay current, that type of thing. I also have some customers in verticals like manufacturing. We work with a manufacturing startup in the northeast suburbs of Seattle, and those folks did a lot of work from home, but when you start to talk about equipment budgets, a MacBook Pro looks like nothing compared to a $500,000 furnace that they're using to process raw materials into component parts for lithium-ion batteries. And so those people are there. Those people are there, fortunately working in a fairly well air-circulated environment, but COVID has pushed through their workforce more than once, and it's been a challenge because a lot of people are working from home and a lot of people are having to go home. And at the same time, we do have a lot of small businesses, a lot of private schools that have been through variants of we're going to do remote learning. We're going to bring students in. We bring half our students in Monday and Wednesday and half of our students in Tuesday and Thursday, and we teach smaller class sizes. We do the rest remote. Definitely, I think one of the schools that I work with just went through another outbreak of COVID right at the end of the school year, so the buildings just kind of emptied. And a lot of our small businesses have not come back to the office. We do work with a lot of businesses where there's a couple of people in the office and there are 15 to 18 people working from home, and in some cases that's led to, well, I know we're based in Seattle, but I moved to Coeur d'Alene and I'm just working from Coeur d'Alene now. We have not seen, and I think one thing that's been interesting to me as the Wi-Fi guy, or the Wi-Fi guy, is we don't get the same level of request for help on those home network connections. There seems to be culturally, there seems to be just kind of a built-in assumption that either those connections work or they work as well as they can, and that there's not a lot to be done about it. Mostly our customers have gotten away with that.
Yeah, in this space that I'm in, my other Wi-Fi does not reach. It's all wired out. Everything's plugged in. I just don't even.
I will say that one thing that we have seen around this, and I'm not yet sure how it's going to play out, is we've seen a couple of established and new vendors start to distribute sort of agent-driven products to install on people's workstations or on people's laptops to provide a centralized collection and aggregation of data about people's network connections. So we've seen, I think, MetaGeek which was recently acquired by the network management company Alvik, introduced a product that was tailored towards collecting information from your remote devices and being able to see in a dashboard who had problems, so that there was something that you could call quantifiable and actionable that an IT person could look at, as opposed to trying to chase the person down via phone call and have them say, well, it didn't work this morning, now it's working okay, I don't want to think about it anymore. So there has been an establishment of that type of diagnostic as a bit more of a market, whereas previously a lot of the diagnostic market for Wi-Fi was, we're going to install sensors in your facility between your access points and see how your facility network is doing. Some of that has transitioned towards trying to understand what's going on the endpoints instead.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just have people run ping 11111 in a terminal and like, tell me when that number gets really big, you know. That's the caveman debugging of Wi-Fi. What do you think, before we leave the Wi-Fi topic, if you had to give people advice on like troubleshooting or setting up Wi-Fi networks, like what's the big thing that you would like, that's number one sort of like rule for you?
So the number one rule for me, oh gosh, because there's so many rules and there's so much in terms of what can and does go wrong. What I probably tell people first and foremost is, and particularly I say this to IT people, and so it's a little bit, it's not quite something that works from an end user perspective, is there are a lot of tools out there at a relatively low cost that you can kind of fire up and grab some basic information on the environment you're in and see what's going on. And I think that when I tell people, what's the best $100 I ever spent on a piece of software, it's probably Adrian Granados's Wi-Fi Explorer Pro, which is a very well put together tool for understanding the Wi-Fi environment that your Mac is in from your Mac's perspective. And the $100 is a bit of a steep purchase for somebody who is doing not doing Wi-Fi professionally. But Adrian has also released a couple of lower priced offerings of the same tool. I think he's got one available for the Mac App Store that may even be free, or $5 or something along those lines, where you can at least you can fire up the application, wait for it to scan the radio spectrum and show you all of the Wi-Fi networks around you. And then at that point, what I say is, you really want to try as little as possible to be overlapping with your neighbor's Wi-Fi. And if you have to overlap with your neighbor's Wi-Fi, that's probably a longer conversation. That's probably my single thing that I like to really press is, I do think that Wi-Fi is a little bit of a combination of science and magic, but I don't think that you get very far by assuming all magic in terms of troubleshooting. So if you're having trouble, I want to gather something from you. I want to gather some data from you and then see what's going on. We can kind of visualize what's going on. Probably the second thing I would say is that I know the vendor told you X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z is kind of true, but kind of not. And don't believe everything the vendor has to say. It's unfortunately cynical, but there it is.
All right.
I did that without cursing at all, didn't I?
I think my favorite Wi-Fi tool is option clicking on the Wi-Fi icon in the toolbar. It just gives you all.
Yeah, and we do that on the phone a lot.
Yeah.
Read me this information. Send me a screenshot.
Makes sense. I'm gonna get to the important stuff now, but before I do that, like, Eric, you're on fire today, and you're just typing this stuff in. You gotta scream it out, man. Join in, man. So here's the important thing. I was looking at your profile on Slack, Chris, and it says, ask me about crab cakes. I'm asking you.
Okay. So there is a food writer who is, I think, fairly well known in food writing circles, but not really known as a food celebrity. And his name is John Thorne. He's getting a little bit older. He wrote a book and has written a lot of books based on his food newsletter, which has been published out of Maine and Massachusetts for 25 years. The newsletter is called Simple Cooking, and he wrote an essay called I think it was Pigeon Hill Bay crab cakes, about his time teaching himself to make crab cakes in Maine. And I am a West Coaster, so blue crab isn't really a thing for us. Dungeness is the thing for us. But one of the points of the essay was that he wrote something along the lines of, I tried crab cake recipes that had all sorts of, bread and crackers and egg. And what I ultimately realized is that crab cakes are best when made of crab. Which is really kind of it's an obvious point, but one that's overlooked a lot. And so I adapted one of his crab cake recipes to West Coast Dungeness crab, and I believe that I no longer have any reason to order crab cakes in a restaurant in the Pacific Northwest, at least. So anybody's welcome to stop by. We'll go to the store. We'll do some cooking. No sauce required. You're just frying crab in butter.
All right, that's a good offer. I will say, and also for Emily, like, we're not crab eaters, but I have made some pretty good mock crab cakes with hearts of palm, and there's good vegan recipes for that. But it's the Old Bay seasoning. That's what you need. But I think what you're touching on, Chris, is, hey, everybody, learn to cook at least a little bit. It's magic, man. Cooking is fun, and it's good to know what's going into your food, and it's an important skill to have. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't get enough time to do it these days. But I think
that's some of the secret to that is, when I say learn to cook, I'm not talking about these meals that take a day before to prepare, and learn to cook some stuff that can be made relatively quickly without you just taking some frozen thing and heating it up in the microwave or the stove or something.
Yeah, my Emily and I were, and I make a distinction between my Emily and Emily Kauslik, because I think that at this point I have something like 5 to 7 Emilys in my day-to-day life, and I have to be specific. But over lunch, my Emily and I were talking about an enchiladas recipe from a relatively famous Mexican cookbook writer named Diana Kennedy. And her recipe for enchiladas starts with making 24 corn tortillas. And it's very much her process is very much analytical. I'm taking apart this whole cooking process, and if you have time, it's fascinating and wonderful, but most of us don't anymore. And so you have to find a way that's not that.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, anyway, we could do a whole hour just on cooking, but we'll get back to that.
I would come back for that.
We should we'll do a supplemental episode.
Save the pasta water.
Yeah.
Yes,
save the pasta water.
Yes.
Even if you end up not using it to save it, you can dump it out later, but save it. You want it.
Good to know.
I'm sorry, token Italian on the call. Save the pasta water. That's all I'll say.
Good tip.
Also, Trader Joe's has pretty good vegan crab cakes. If you're short on time, got to reheat something to have dinner cook, which I have found myself to be recently.
I made some
got Trader
once
Joe's nearby.
with Hearts of Palm, and they were really good. I'd never had Hearts of Palm before I encountered that recipe.
Trader Joe's also has a Hearts of Palm pasta, which is pretty good. But anyway, we're getting way off. We're getting way off.
We're getting far afield.
Yeah. Also, in your Slack biography, it says you're the board secretary of the MacAdmins Foundation, and I know there's been tons of talk and sort of information about the MacAdmins Foundation, which has recently kind of started up and solidified. So I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit about that.
So, and it's great to have Emily and Caleb here because they've been a key part of this. And I was historically, I was probably a little late to the Slack. I was a denizen of and mostly a lurking denizen of the OSX server IRC channel back in the day, and spent a lot of time in there just watching other people who are vastly more technical than I am talking through deep problems in the world of macOS management. And so when the crew who founded the MacAdmin Slack, frankly, is kind of an experiment, and that crew included Caleb Coy, started it up, I was a little foot draggy in terms of going over there. But once I was there and joined that community, we had this experience where, in a lot of ways, you can think about the MacAdmins community as kind of an accidental community. That is, historically, there has been a Mac person at a company who's been the person who's saddled with this particular task, particularly when in the days when this was not a popular task and it wasn't a task that a lot of folks had a view that had much of a future to it. I have a relative who, when I got my first job in Seattle working for an Apple reseller, sent me a bunch of Windows NT 4 manuals and said, you should do something that has a little more value than what you're doing. And I think that there's always been a sense that the MacAdmins are kind of solo operators and have bounced from improvisational and found community to improvisational and found community. If you want to talk about, and I'm haven't been around quite long enough that I was really an active participant in any in-city Mac user groups, but Mac user groups, email lists, IRC, bouncing to Twitter, and then finding ourselves in Slack and realizing that whereas I think the IRC channel for OSX server or OS X server had a couple of hundred members, it was only a few weeks before the MacAdmin Slack had membership numbering in the thousands, and it was kind of a revelation. And together with that, we were able to move from a free Slack instance with, I think the free Slack instances cycle the scroll back at 10,000 messages. We were able to, because of the positioning of certain members of the MacAdmins community at Slack the company, we were able to get a professional instance sponsored. And that grew and grew and grew. And we did a talk at Penn State campfire sessions where we talked through the kind of, it's 1,000, now it's 5,000, now it's 15,000, now it's 40. What are we doing here? What's happening? How did this community get so big? And all that time, there was kind of this underlying tension of, oh God, what if we had to pay for this? And you go look at the Slack pricing page and you say pro instance, $6.67 per month per user. And in the background, Slack grew as a company. Some staff shifted in, shifted out. The sponsor of the MacAdmin Slack on staff at Slack changed at least once. And we arrived at the point where we were looking at 45,000 members of a free Slack with unlimited scroll back, 5,000 active users a week, thousands, tens of thousands of messages a day. And then Salesforce came along and said, hey, we're buying Slack. And our sponsor on staff at Slack approached a few of us and said, I may not be here forever. And that was when a number of us said, well, poop emoji. That was kind of, what do we do about this?
Yeah, and it wasn't the first time, like Chris alluded to. We had the conversation with the employee who basically Slack employees are comped this like small paid instance. It's only supposed to be like for at most a few hundred people, which we drastically overshot very quickly. And Slack kind of brushed us under a rug or something. We're not entirely sure how they were cool with it for this long and still have been up until this point. But we just hit the point where we're like, we can't assume this is going to be an agreement that they're going to be cool with forever, because they are potentially losing lots of money on this instance. And as a community, if something happened and we couldn't pay for it, and I will apologize, I have remodeling happening in my house right now if you hear noise in the background. If all of a sudden Slack came to us and wanted us to foot a bill and we couldn't, what would happen to the years and years and years of historical data, of conversations, of shared documents, scripts, friendships in the Slack? Like, what would happen? And we're like, okay, we have to sit and take this seriously and figure out what it would take to figure out how to maintain some semblance of independence. Because I think that the word sponsor is, Slack does or does not realize that they have been the primary sponsor of the MacAdmin Slack up until this point, right? Yep. To have the entire community hinging on one sponsor makes us a little, as much as we love Slack and we love the platform, is kind of puts everybody in a bit of a bind. So we're like, okay, it's time. We need to sit down. We need to find a working group, and we have to figure out how to operationalize and make sure we maintain the independence of this community where it is now, and be in a position where we can support it if it ends up like it has in the past. New, hot, shiny, sexy platform appears that the community wants to be on, and we end up all on a new platform. We want to be ready for that, right? We're trying to think big picture, and I will pass it on to somebody else as they are.
Yeah,
I mean, I think Plan B is you could always just hop back to IRC. I mean,
but Freenode's not still there, is it?
No, I very specifically said IRC and not Freenode. Freenode had some really strange story. Like someone bought it and started doing. I think they even wound up shutting it down. There was some weirdo.
They did, I think. There was some very strange drama around that.
There was some strange drama around it, but it's all open source. You can stand up your own IRC server, and
And I think that one of the things that happened in the course of these discussions, because Emily's absolutely right, a few of us who are generally socially friendly in a number of different rooms in the Slack looked at this and said, well, what is... Terry Pratchett has a great line in one of his novels where everybody's still in the sense of what is someone going to do about this, and hasn't yet transitioned to the question of what am I going to do about this. And we started with this kind of concept of, we have this great resource that has, and I think this is Emily's phrase, it's a permanent hallway track. And has proven to be of immense value to this community. We have this great resource. We started with this conversation of how do we preserve this resource? And as we started to talk about what an organization looking at preserving this resource might look like, we realized that we were gradually transitioning into a conversation of, it's not just about this resource. How do we create an independent future for this community such that we can decide, okay, if Slack ceases to exist as a company, ceases to exist as a technology. Something goes wrong with the instance and we need to move. How do we have sort of a community that is less dependent on the vagaries of the market and the vagaries of technology? How do we be more deliberate about this? And that transitioned into some of these other discussions about, well, if we were founding a nonprofit to first and foremost license the Slack so that we had some kind of legal right to be here because we're paying for it, where can we then go from that point? Because it's the lesson of technology is that it may be that Slack is not going to be around forever, but can we go from being this kind of accidental community to being a little bit more deliberate, a little bit more intentional about this?
So I think that's interesting. That's an interesting origin story, but I think I understand that the MacAdmin's Foundation is intent on doing much more than just being a vehicle to pay for Slack, right? Like
that is now our goal. Yeah, that is now our goal. Is that we really did transition from the kind of panicked sort of save the Slack to a broader set of you have to file a formal mission statement when you incorporate a 501c3 with the IRS, and we have a mission statement and we have a bunch of tenants, and just kind of reading off of our organizational documentation, we organized, and I quote, specifically for the purpose of advancing global community of people who manage Apple devices at large and small scales. And that has transitioned from the kind of concept of saving the Slack as, well, how can we provide help to Mac admins otherwise, not just preserving this technology space. And Emily, do you want to talk about some of those things?
Yeah, so like basically how the conversations kind of led was like, at first we're like, okay, putting a 501c3 together is a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of organizing. It's a lot of time. The filing IRS was behind 9, 10, 12 months. What do we do in the meantime if Salesforce comes asking for money and we're not ready, and we're like losing our minds? So we got Andy Fife, who's a consultant who works specifically for helping organizations and groups just like ours do things just like this and help us get all our ducks in a row. Was extremely helpful and basically fundamental in all of the things that we're going through. And as we were going through the conversations, when we were talking about the real like mission and meaning, and what we're getting at is like, why do we feel so compelled to protect where the community is right now, which is Slack, right? Why do we feel this compulsion, this passion to make sure that it is maintained? And it is because of all the people in it. It's because of the knowledge that's shared. It's about the fact that our community is basically built around knowledge sharing and supporting each other in this open platform, and has been for a long time through all of the different methods that Mac admins have been getting together, from conferences to meetups and user groups to IRC to the listservs to everything, right? Twitter, passing each handles around on Twitter, and Jamf Nation, and all these other resources that are out there that so many people are a part of, right? It was the people. So it was like, okay, we know we're here to support the people. And right now the people are in Slack, but that's not it, right? The people are getting training and documentation. The people are looking for career guidance and mentorship, or providing career guidance and mentorship to others, to lifting up people who are on marginalized genders, identities, geographic locations, financial situations, the list goes on, right? Who are coming here as a free resource to help build their career, to network, to make professional friendships, to have some people that they can commiserate with. Because it all started with, even with me, my first IT job, I was the only Mac person. I'm like, I don't know what to do. I was help desk, and now we need to manage our Macs. How you manage them? What does that mean? Right. So it was digging around online. It was finding the IRC and the Google groups, and Jamf Nation for me was very formative. And I think it was for a lot of admins, even outside of Jamf customers, it's still a forum. So like, what are admins out there looking for? And I think the fact that Apple came along pretty early on in our process and said, hey, we've got Apple IT certification that's coming. We want to partner with you to facilitate making that more financially feasible for people who need assistance in the community. And kind of soft launched our nonprofit in the process when they put the press documentation out for it a week or two.
That was a bit of a shock.
That was
a
get the website ready. Oh my God, we don't have a logo yet. We got to put stuff. I was like, fortunately, we all work at employers and have partners and spouses who are super supportive of all the work we've been doing on this, who get why we're on these calls, who acknowledge our passion, even if they don't quite understand it, I would say. and I was like, I went to my boss that day and I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be working today. I've got to get this website out. Here's the press release from Apple. Here's what's going on. And my boss was like, hey, totally fine. Do what you need to do. You know, like we're very fortunate in that regard.
It may have been that we had been meeting for over a year face-to-face in Zoom and Google Meet and, you know, whatever video conferencing technology we happened to fire up the meeting in that day. And the day that the Apple press release came out, we all, I think, you know, I'm West Coast, so I'm the last one to wake up and get going. The press release hits, and suddenly in our conversation channel, there was a moment of, we've been doing this for over a year and we don't have a group photo. Can we get everybody together for a photo of the press release?
I was like, okay, we all need to get on Zoom so I can take a screenshot, and I need to get some pictures together so that I can put it on the website, because we have nothing to put on the website right now. We have nothing.
I was sick that morning and slept in too, so I missed that entire conversation. So,
it was.
And I had the photo. I think I photoshopped you in later.
Yeah.
Seattle spring morning where there was no light coming into the house, and I'm walking around throwing open every window going, is there any place that the laptop is going to pick up enough light that I'm not going to look like I'm on a 1970s TV transmission? And the answer is no. There's not a place today.
It was an adventure, but I have to say it was kind of third-party validation that we kind of needed. In a weird way. I don't know if this is going to make sense or not, but like the fact that, because Apple could have very well put out the release about the certification and not really mentioned a whole lot, or maybe said there's a program that you can apply for and details will be coming soon, or whatever else that they could have done in a press release about their program, right? They gave us like 2 solid paragraphs and a drop quote about what the foundation, the MacAdmins Foundation, was for, which was, so I think that really helped with a lot of people being like, whoa, MacAdmins Foundation, there's a link, there's a website, and we're like, yeah, there is, cool. Well, we're working on it.
In some ways, it's instant chaos, but it's also instant credibility on some level. It's like really adding credence to the amount of work we've been doing.
I remember talking to my husband about it that day, and I was like, we weren't really anticipating this. We were hoping to do this like next week or the week. I think the plan was during WWDC was when we were going to drop our press release, which I think was the next week, I think, or something like that. And he was like, you know what, you've been working so hard, and you all are, knowing me, you're an engineer and you get super stuck in like, we got to do this perfect, and we have to think about all the scenarios and work through everything perfectly. And he's like, you know what, at this point, just rip off the Band-Aid. You know, you're doing something good for the community. You know, there's value in what you're doing, and people are going to go along with you and support you. Because, you know, it's like I talk about talking to people on the MacAdmin Slack all day. Like, oh yeah, in the Slack we were talking about this today and that today. He's like, they're your friends. They're all on board. You've been working on this for so long. Maybe it's good that Apple just kind of dropped that in there so that it could be out there in the open, and you don't have to get too stuck in the nitty gritty. You can just get out of the trees, enjoy the forest view, let it be out there in the world, which I think was very true. for me in particular, I was very like, the same thing goes with like the merch campaign that we put out on Bonfire recently to try to get like shirts, and like I'm wearing like a test press of something right now. I spent months just like stressing out over it. Like, what if they don't like the way that I have the logo on the shirt? What if no one wants to buy it? Or what if they don't like the color that I selected on the first one? Or like, this is screen printing, so it needs to be solid colors, but our logo has a gradient, so we can't really do that yet, and it'll cost too much money. And are people going to be upset that it's not the 4-color? And so, and I was, and I thought to what he said, and I was like, you know what? We just need to put it out there.
Yeah.
And we'll see what happens.
Yep.
And if people don't buy shirts, then you can just try again later with different shirts. It's okay, Emily.
I remember about 3-ish years ago, I think, I'm guessing, I'm estimating, but someone in the community, it might have been one of you, I don't remember, but someone came up with a MacAdmin's flag, like a banner. It was like this black banner, and it said MacAdmins. And
it wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't
that was actually around
was...
the time that we were starting this conversation.
Okay, so it was like a year ago.
Yeah, it was about a year ago. And it was just like a, hey, I'm thinking about doing this for fun. Do any of you, maybe, are you interested? Right? So there's a small group of us that have those just for fun. But man, I learned some lessons from his experience on that. And I know Chris can speak to it a little bit more too, because he helped a little more directly with it. But I have to say, the logistics around physical things, I think we kind of forget about it because we were kind of in the ephemeral. I would love to just like print a bunch of stuff and have a warehouse and a team that does order fulfillment, and we could do all sorts of crazy shit, and it would be awesome.
Yeah. Just coincidentally, the person who conceptualized the camp flag was the same person at Slack who was our instant sponsor, and it was a totally unrelated kind of in-joke between himself and me.
So those aren't a thing anymore, because I was going to say
they were not an official thing with the MacAdmins Foundation. They've just become pseudo-identified with it because we did this very informal, hey, who wants one of these? And this person ended up facilitating an order of something like 150 or 175 of them personally, and processing all of the address shipping for everybody who wanted one, this, that, and the other thing. So it was a totally random coincidence. I had to, the only thing that I'm really responsible for with respect to the flag was sort of egging on the idea, and I'm also responsible for We Never Close. So that was my addition.
You do have a shop, though. If you want to plug the shop, you have a shop.
Yeah.
Where people they can buy stuff and they get something and they help the foundation.
It's on this really cool platform called Bonfire, and Bonfire specializes in working with groups that are raising funds, usually for charity. And if you're a nonprofit and you verify your nonprofit status with them, you get extremely discounted pricing on order fulfillment, which is really beneficial for us. Like we went through the work, and we are a 501c3. So we're able to verify our status with our IRS paperwork or whatever else, which means our transaction fees for them are dropped by like 60 to 70%, which is money. At the end of the day, money's money, and we want more, as much as we can get. We're ambitious. We want to do scholarship.
Did we lose?
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. We have big dreams, and being able to help cut checks for people to do cool stuff, like host meetups in cool locations, or travel to attend conferences, and potentially even childcare costs and family care costs for when you have to travel, and having grant programs and stuff like that. The money has to come from somewhere. And one of the places
I'm glad
is selling merch.
I'm glad that you named those things, because I was going to ask about some of the future plans. But before we get off the store, plug it. Where do people find this store? How do they get there?
So the URL for it is a bit of a slog. But if you go to macadmins.org and you look in the footer, there is a link to store. It'll take you there. We've been posting about it on Twitter and Instagram and our social accounts, so you can look there too. I don't know if you can see the link on my video right there. It goes to the donate page. It's macadmins.org/donate. If you're like, I don't need a shirt, but I want to give you money, thank you. Go there. We work with DonorBox, who specializes in doing fundraising and direct donations and recurring donations for organizations like ours. Merch is a small piece of the puzzle. I do think it's well worth spending a little bit of time thanking the organizations and corporate entities that are supporting the MacAdmins Foundation from the get-go and felt very passionately about being charter sponsors. It includes quite a few of the employers of those of us on this call, including Kanji and Jamf, and also including Collide and a few other organizations, including smaller organizations like the MacAdmins podcast, which I know can sometimes get conflated with the foundation because there is some overlap. Tom and I.
There's a lot of, there's a lot of overlap, frankly.
There's a lot of overlap.
And it can be hard to tell, but they are intended to be two separate and distinct organizations.
And the MacAdmins podcast was actually one of the very first financial sponsors of the MacAdmins Foundation and helped us pay for the consulting fees to actually get all of this off the ground. So to our Patreon sponsors and sponsors of the podcast who helped in that indirect way, thank you for making a lot of this possible. We also are listed in a lot of fundraising platforms that organization uses for charitable giving, including Benevity, PayPal Giving, Deed, we're in GuideStar. We're in a lot of those places. We're trying to get Amazon Smile set up for those of you who like to do charitable giving through like indirect donations through purchasing and stuff like that. It's just a ton of paperwork to get listed in all of these places. So just taking us some time to get everywhere. But if you have a company that does matching, we're on most of the platforms that major organizations use for charitable giving and should qualify since we are a 501c3 charitable organization, nonprofit organization. You should be able to qualify for matching if your organization does that. And I'm happy to answer questions about doing any of that stuff. If you want to get in touch with us, you can just email giving@macadmins.org. And that goes to the board, and we are happy to meet with organizations or representatives to talk through what donating means and how you do it and all that good stuff. We've gotten better at it over time. I find it very hard to ask people for money. I don't know if it's my Midwestern upbringing. It just
frankly, you've become in the time that we've been working on this. I want to call out the entire board for just a second, because in particular, I find myself as a person who can join a project and help be a part of a project and help move a project along, but I can't, and I'm temperamentally unsuited to kind of driving a project the way that in particular, Emily and Tom as our co-chairs have really kind of driven this forward and have done the bulk of the work around kind of as much as Emily says she doesn't like to ask for money. Emily, you've gotten really, really good at presenting this and asking for the money and talking about this in a way that sort of evinces that passion in a way that is more kind of the passion I bring to mostly just recounting ridiculous IT situations. I bring a significantly larger amount of kind of, I guess cynicism would be a word for it. But having Tom and Emily kind of lead this effort and essentially be leading this effort to talk to a lot of these sponsors and be the ones asking for money and negotiate in a way that I just don't feel comfortable has been invaluable. We wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise. And having, Rich Troughton act as treasurer and be one of the folks who's really there to handle and analyze and understand a lot of the nuts and bolts of the finances of it and the particular process that we went through to try to get approved as a 501c3 and get us to the point where we could legally take money. We had this whole sort of, we had this whole sort of side quest where We haven't really talked about it much, but before we,
Do you want me to break it down a little bit?
I want to tell this one because I want to.
Okay, you tell it.
We have this side quest where we didn't know how we were going to legally take money, and we realized in talking to Andy Fife that you could get another officially recognized 501c3 to act as a fiscal sponsor to you. And we spent, and Rich in particular, as the treasurer, spent several months reaching out to various 501c3s who had missions that were at least partially aligned with ours. And we ultimately realized that Charles Edge had founded and gotten recognized the Minnesota Computer History Museum. And there was a moment of about 6 weeks when we thought that we were going to go public with the MacAdmins Foundation. Please donate to the Minnesota Computer History Museum. And that was just going to be a thing that we were going to try to explain to people with a straight face. And how do you even
I think it's hilarious.
I mean, it's like KEXP, a service of the University of Washington.
Yeah, and the concept of a fiscal sponsor for nonprofit organizations, super common. Like Eric was just alluding to, super common. It happens all the time. What I love is that the board of the Minnesota Computer History Museum is Charles Edge, Andrina Kelly, Jill Rennick, everybody's favorites. And then Rich joined the board to help facilitate the fiscal sponsorship, fiscal agent relationship that we were trying to set up. The fear there being, if Salesforce comes to us before we hear back from the IRS and get approval, and we need money, how do we get it in as legal and T's crossed, I's dotted, bows tied, right, and tax deductible for the
organization. It won't help anyone if a lot of you end up in jail, right?
Right.
We don't want to be in jail. No. And that's why we hired a consultant, and he said this was an option.
And just to clarify, what is the salary you all are taking as board members of the MacAdmins Foundation? Just for clarity.
$0. We cannot take any payment, gifts, anything.
No free swag.
We bought our own shirts and swag from the Bonfire shop.
That's super important to say out loud.
Speaking as a person who actively tries to avoid wearing vendor swag wherever possible, I bought a mug and I bought a shirt. So
helps that we picked a shirt color that you suggested.
Yes. Yeah.
If you liked the storm dark heathered purple, you can thank Chris for that one. That was not one of my initial choices, but it looks like the shirts are going to be really nice on that color. So I'm excited to see people hopefully posting them all over social media so that we can reshare and do word of mouth. And as conferences and teleconferences and stuff start up, would love to see people like casually drinking out of their MacAdmins Foundation mugs on their calls and the whole thing. And I know we've gotten so many questions about other types of merchandise like button-ups and collared shirts and things like that skew a little more professional. The Bonfire store just doesn't have that stuff in their catalog. And I'm trying to work with them to see if they are interested in adding that kind of thing. But there's also the whole, not to get too nuts and bolts on it, which is very much the route I go in every conversation I have. You tend to not screen print on polos. You tend to embroider. And that's a whole other garment industry thing. And we're just not, we want to get to that point. We're just not there yet. And from like a logistical perspective, that's the point where you take orders and you get merch made and then you ship it to people. But as we've kind of alluded to, we're all over the place, right? I'm in Texas. Chris is in Seattle, right? Caleb is in the Midwest, and Rich and Tom are out on the East Coast, like Maryland, DC area. And so we don't have like an office or a warehouse, or like, we're not like NPR that has like a corporate headquarters in a bunch of states, and like, we just don't have the IRL logistical stuff for that right now. I would love to keep operational costs as low as possible to maximize your donation dollars. So if we can avoid that model as long as possible, it'd probably be for the best, but we're going to figure that stuff out.
There was a moment 3 or 4 weeks ago, maybe 5 weeks ago now, when we mean, the first thing we did after Apple dropped the press release was say to one another, maybe we need a MacAdmins Foundation channel in the Slack to talk about this. So we built that, and then 4 or 5 weeks ago, someone came to us in that channel and said something along the lines of, so y'all are kind of operating on the NPR model now, asking for donations and asking for corporate sponsors. Do you have a tote bag yet?
And
we
frankly,
went,
we
and
do.
we didn't. Now we do.
Wow.
And
wow.
frankly, I am disappointed at the amount of orders for tote bags, for how many jokes we're told about them. Go out there and buy your tote bags, please.
Yeah. It's definitely it's been a lesson in kind of what's the cultural joke and what is it that people actually want. Because the t-shirts are selling.
Thank you, Tom. Tom says he will order a tote bag. I appreciate you, Tom Larkin.
This has been really fascinating. We've blown past the hour mark that I usually set for these conversations, but it was all fascinating to hear. And I'm going to revisit the Terry Pratchett quote that you gave out, Chris, around like, well, there's something to get done. What am I doing to solve this? And
it's from the end. It's from the end of Thud.
I appreciate everyone involved from the bottom of my heart, because I know I am one of tens of thousands of beneficiaries to the work that you're doing. And I'm really, really, really looking forward to all the great work. And I think there'll be some of it, Emily, like some of the things you pointed out in terms of like getting people to conferences or providing childcare. It's like, it's such an important thing, but is almost invisible in some ways to some people. Like, you show up at a conference, you had a great conference. You don't think about maybe how some of the speakers got there, or some of the attendees got there, or some of the services that they might have required. So that is really amazing work. I really appreciate it.
And I'll throw out one more thing as we wrap. We know a lot of people want to figure out how they can get involved, and we need people to want to be involved. We do not want to be on this board forever. In fact, we can't be, like, legally, right? We are always happy to hear from people who want to be involved, from board level down to like just ideas that you have around things that you would like to see the MacAdmins Foundation do in the community, whatever the case may be. We do have a contact form on the website specifically for volunteer feedback. One of the first programs we want to work on is a mentorship program. I'm hoping that we can start kicking some of that off in the fall with informational meetings and info gathering, and trying to figure out what the infrastructure behind it is going to be to get IT, right? What does the program actually look like? What's the framework for it? A lot of people have already written in. I'm hoping to start reaching back out to people once we get through the summer season and merch and some of this initial stuff that we're trying to work on as a foundation, and it gets stuff kicked off in the fall, so that start of the new year, we can have a 12-month cycle of some kind of mentorship program. So head to the website, fill out the volunteer form. I know some people on this call have, and I know some people sitting on the stream have, and that are in our channel have, and follow us on social have, and thank you so much. Look to hear specifically probably from me in the near future around that. If you haven't and you want to get involved, fill out the form so we have your email and your information and what you're interested in contributing or being a part of, and we'll start figuring out what that will look like as we grow out the organization and get more volunteers on board to get stuff going for the community.
And be aware, we're essentially building the airliner in flight at this point. And so
it's a good analogy.
It's fascinating. It is terrifying. It can be very stressful, and it can be very hard to get questions where the answer is, well, we have an intention, but we don't have an answer. And so there is some of that. And so we really want people to kind of come to us and work with us around that idea that what we've decided this is not what this is ultimately going to be. And we want it to be more than, and I'll, again, putting on my cynical hat, we want this to be more than 5 straight white mostly I won't speak for Emily, but speaking for particularly Rich, Tom, and myself, straight, white, middle-aged, because many of us are in that kind of demographic, and
Yeah.
we want it to be more than it is at this point.
Yeah, and if it helps, honestly, the board is the working group that got things off the ground. And we want to be in a position sooner rather than later to be able to pass the baton and let the community run with it. And we would love your feedback on what that looks like. We honestly, truly feel that way.
I had no idea, and I've learned more from this conversation than all the reading and side conversations I've had around the MacAdmin Foundation. So with that, I'm going to thank you again, wrap things up. Thank you, Chris, for joining us and telling a bit of your background and knowing I was going to ask about MacAdmin Foundation. Thanks for grabbing some other people and having them join and tell the story. It's been
thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for having us. It's been great. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Like Chris, I think I usually bumped into you at Penn State MacAdmin's conference, so I can't wait till we are sort of all back
in person again. Oh my God.
Yeah. So I can see you all in person. So yep, I will get this recording posted in the channel and on Twitter, and you can help use that to spread the word perhaps some more. So that's a great way to end it, just reminding people, get involved somehow, whether that's a donation or ideas or volunteering for the board. And thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.